good morning. You're welcome again this morning to Searching the Heart. And I'm going to continue from where I stopped in the last episode, not just the previous one, but 2 episodes back, about the sources, the history sources of the Jos crisis and the Nigerian insurgency. Of course, we know that these things usually take global significance, and somebody has written a book on that called Michael Jennings. Yeah, I think that's the first name, Michael Jennings, talking about the global crisis. Okay, and of course, somebody like Eliza Griswold also talked about these things, talking about the 10th parallel. Okay, it's similar to what Michael Jennings is saying. It's a global thing. Christianity, of course, Islam are global things, and these things affect a belt, certain groups of nations, because such nations can trace their history, collective history, thousands of years, even though that history may not be mainline history, but they know these things, and I've tried to point this out in one of my previous videos. Okay, and so these are the things that are happening, and this is what I want to try to dabble with today, talking about theological solutions to insurgency. Okay, theological solutions to insurgency. There are bigger issues. We keep on talking about these things, and today we would like to double. I would like to double into this one. I talked about the polarity of 2 cultures living side by side, Hausa and Kwararafa empires, and these 2 cultures living side by side are still silently affecting one another. Okay, social issues are very, very delicate issues when you talk about human nature, and this is what modern civilization sometimes, somehow in relation to Christianity has really failed to look at, because the human nature reacts in particular ways to issues, and sometimes it's not easy to just say things are going on in this way and so they should continue in that way, or it's not mathematics. Human nature has nothing to do with mathematics. It's very complicated. Okay, so I'd like to trace the long history of the Kwararafa and Hausa, the polarity of the Kwararafa and the Hausa existing side by side. Of course, when you look at the Hausa narratives, Kwararafa or Kororofa in some sources is considered one of the enclaves of Hausa kingdoms. Okay, the Banza Bokwe, among the Banza Bokwe. But of course, when you look up that of Kwararafa, you discover that Kwararafa predates Hausa as an empire. Okay, and so these are the issues. Okay, and so if you want to find real solutions, you have to look at the theology behind these different empires. Okay, the Hausa people prided themselves actually in the discovery and the use of modern technology at that time, ancient technology as it were, that was coming in from the north, Arabia, in terms of clothing, in terms of metal, use of metal. And this is how the Hausa kingdoms became strong and upstaged the Kwararafa kingdoms. Okay, though the Kwararafa were horsemen, very, very skilled horsemen, and this is how they dominated most of Middle Belton Nigeria in those days, even going to the boundaries of the Borno kingdom. Okay, and it was first the Borno people who conquered the Kwararafa. Of course, I would like to add that The Borno people conquered the Kwararafa, and later on, of course, the Hausa conquered the Borno, kind of made it a one of the states within the Hausa states. Okay, so this is just the issue. Of course, the story is there. The whole story is there. This is not my focus for today. Now the takeover of the Hausa and later on the Fulani incursion of through the jihad, of course, now created a new system in place, a new government in place that was going through Nigeria. Of course, the takeover was so swift, and of course, the record will tell you that between 1804 to 1808, these things took place. And when you see the expanse to which this conquest or this empire grew throughout the north, right down into parts of Yoruba land, you discover that 4 years is a little time for that to happen. And that's how we know that, of course, it lasted more than 4 years. And the effects were seen right through into the early 1900s. Okay? And some of those things were still going on. But then, one very important thing that we must know that contributed to the fall of the Kwararafa, although it was not limited to the Kwararafa itself, was the issue of slave trade. Okay, slave trade was an important factor that led to the fall of the Kwararafa, that led to the takeover of the new empires that came. We'll talk about this after the short break. So the influence of slave trade. Okay, the influence of slave trade. Africa, for a very long time, has a very long history, of course. And we know when we study, I recommend some of the studies done by Zainab Badawi for the BBC. You know, she goes right through tracing the history of Egypt, right into Sudan, down into Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, you know, right across Africa. And that is a more detailed study of the development of Africa before the transatlantic slave trade, before the colonial era and all that. And you know, so this Africa had a very long history. And what determined a lot of what was going on in Africa was the geography, okay, the climate and the geography. Most of sub-Saharan Africa is made up of the savanna down to the forest regions, and of course, these were thick groves that were difficult to penetrate. And that hindered a lot of the conquering tribes from the Middle East that were more focused in the Middle East from coming right in, of course, and preserved some of the culture. And even during the times of shipping, it is said that there were no coasts that the ships could dock at, okay, because the coasts are not really having any harbor, you know, for ships. And so it made it very difficult. The only points at which ships could come into Africa was through Egypt, through North Africa, and through East Africa, where shipping technology on that scale was abundant. Okay, so this is the issue with Africa, and so it preserved a lot of the internal structure of Africa. And what that created was that, of course, there was just a few powers that dominated the history of Africa for a very long time. Of course, the Ethiopian, and later on, what you call the Nubian dynasties. Okay, so these were the empires that dominated the life of Africa, and within that time of dominance, they raided parts of Africa for slaves, and some of the treaties. It is recorded that some of the treaties that kept peace between the Nubian and the Muslim kingdoms that were raiding from the north was the exchange of slaves, okay, for almost 400 years or so, okay. The exchange of slaves, they kept on exchanging slaves to keep the peace, because the Islamic kingdoms were raiding the Christian kingdoms of Nubia, and the only way they could keep them at bay was, to exchange slaves. And of course, where did the slaves come from? Came from within Africa, the other smaller, weaker kingdoms in Africa. And so this is some of the tainted legacy of the Kwarafa period, okay? Of course, the Kwarafa period became sort of a vassal for the Nubians. We have to assume so, although there is no real record of this, but it is very, very, very clear that the only way they got horses, they became expert horsemen, was by exchanging horses for slaves, of course, and sometimes salt. They traded in salt, yes, they traded in some other things, okay? But a major part of that was slaves, and that is how the Kwarafa became so powerful, okay? So that was the legacy of the Kwarafa. And the Kwarafa is such an old kingdom that it even predates contemporary Islam. And this is the issue, okay? And so, but what made Islam more powerful was that they had the kingdoms north of Nubia, of course, had better access to modern technology in terms of course, they majorly supplied horses, of course, and cotton, the woven cotton, clothing, those were the things that traded in those days. And of course, metal, okay, though the Kwarafa too were known to be cotton metal smelters, but it was not, their technology was not as developed as that of the ancient Garamantians, for instance, and of course those in Egypt. So this is how slowly the kingdoms of Borno that had access were more advantage to the northern kingdoms, the Taurids up north, became stronger and invaded the Kwarafa and dominated them, reduced the power of their kingdom. And that is how the Hausa kingdoms came up, through the influence of Islam, of course. They came up through the influence of Islam, but later on it became a caliphate. Did not start as a caliphate because a lot of the Christian kingdoms, there is evidence now to show that a lot of the Hausa kingdoms of north were actually Christian kingdoms, okay, under Nubia. But because they now became, the transformation into Islam took time, a lot of time, because it took a lot of time before the Nubians were properly conquered. And it was after they were truly conquered that Danfodio began his own move to conquer the area called Nigeria, of course, through Cameroon, even westward. Okay, so he began that, and in a short period of time, he actually gained a lot of territory over time. Okay, so this is the history of that rich relationship between the Kwarafa and other kingdoms around them. And the Kwarafa, you may tend to look down on the Kwarafa, but history has shown us that they really dominated a lot of Nigeria, Middle Belt and Nigeria, Northern Nigeria for a long time before the Hausa kingdoms took over. And when they took over, they rewrote the history and they rewrote the governance, the system of governance, and they changed everything. Okay, And so now you see, what you see obviously is the dominance of the Hausas, and very much because of the influence of the Taurids up north. But really what is underneath is the Kwararafa. Okay, very important. You need to understand that. We'll continue after this.
A sign of hope still lingers in the evening sky, and the cock still crows at dawn, that the children still have a future, that even in the dark their eyes still glow with hope for that pathway to justice, peace and equity, that even in their youth they will see a better Nigeria, and they shall have cause to smile again, that the elderly will lay down their heavy burden and cease from their struggle, and in their twilight they will see a glimmer of hope. At 50, let peace reign from engraved in gold and grow. A Christian partnership for a better humanity.
So we'll move on by looking at the source of power in ancient civilizations. What was the source of their power? Okay, it's totally different from today. Today is all about the arms race. Today it's all about what kind of economy you are able to create in terms of technology, in terms of, and that technology is driven by the sale of harnessing and sale of raw materials, and being able to have the modern economy, of course, drive it, which is presently the paper. It started with the paper economy and now has moved to the electronic economy, of course. So this is what drives today, but in those days it was totally different. In those days, theology governed, was a very major source of the power of ancient civilizations. Okay, theology is a very important source of the power of ancient civilizations. Now, we will see this. We will use an example to show us, give us an example of what this is all about. It's very hard to really put your finger on it now, but when in Africa, this is what governed, what kingdom had power or not. It was based on theology. Some of the tales of somebody like Shaka the Zulu, for instance, was that he had a very powerful magician, okay, a very powerful sorceress, and she was the one who practically bankrolled his government because of her powerful magic. Okay, just like the tale of Merlin the Great in England. Okay, so it's just very similar. Okay, and most of Africa, this is what happened. In fact, one of the things that stopped the Romans and other ancient kingdoms from invading most of sub-Saharan Africa was the fear of demons. Okay, it was feared that the demons usually attacked at night, and they created a lot of havoc. So theology was the major source of their power, and of course those stories abound. Okay, and we were looking at that in the context of very recent happenings. Okay, and we will see what that is. The second source of their power is technology. Okay, technology, metal, for instance, clothing. With clothing, people can be bought. Clothing was a currency in those days. Okay, it could be exchanged for food and other supplies. Okay, so that is one of the powers. Part of what brought down the Kwararafa Empire. Okay, because they didn't have access to clothing. Okay, they had to trade slaves for horses. Okay, and weapons and all that. So this is what was at stake. Your ability to manufacture weapons, to have to keep your people satisfied materially with material things. Clothing was one of those things. Okay, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the number 3 social treaties, okay? Social treaties. Now, social treaties were, in terms of government, okay? In terms of government, what kind of government do the people accept? Now, most of the kingdoms under the Kwararafa were city-states, and they continued existing as city-states. In that, of course, you find a man who had 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 wives, and of course those wives had children, and from his own house grew a city, and of course that created a city-state, and that is all it was all about. The Hausa Banzabakwe and Hausa Bakwe and Banzabakwe is all built on that. The Banzabakwe were said to be the concubines of Bao, who was the ancestor of the Hausa people. But of course, when you listen to the Kwararafa story, you discover that that was a rewritten story, co-opted from the Kwararafa, the real Kwararafa story. Okay, so the Hausas kind of rewrote the whole story, okay, so that they will be able to keep control over the empire. Now, this is just the thing, but of course, they were telling something similar to the truth, and that was like the civilization is built on the patriarchal system that was existing. Okay, a man with his wives, and those women gave birth to children for him, and that became his empire, and that was just as simple as that. So this is just what it is. The social treaty determined who ruled, and the Hausa tried to create this kind of environment by creating the Banzabakwe, and the Hausa Bakwe concept. Okay, and this is what it is. So those treaties kept their dominance going. Okay, and established all the emirates for them. But of course, they could not do this properly until Danfodio came in, introducing an additional concept. And what was that concept? The reform of Islam. Okay, and of course, Islam became the new tool in this new government. Okay, and so this is what happened. And I tell you that the Banzabakwe thing did not take root until the conquest of Danfodio. Okay, and so this is the thing. This is the thing. It is a very new story, of course, and that is why we still see the influence of the Kwararafa beneath. Because at the time the British came, the jihad was still going on. Okay, it had not really established itself. It was weakening at that time. Yes, and this is the issue. So they had not really established. The Hausa were very successful because of their penchant for trade. That was the whole thing. It wasn't the military power. Most of the military power was from the Kwararafa system that existed. Okay, so it was their penchant for trade, their love for trade, that created most of the successes, and they won over a lot of the Kwararafa enclaves, and until Islam came and kind of enhanced the military power, and of course created that new system in place. So you have to be able to be in the context and to read through the material, and then you will really understand what is really going on. Okay, so this is the issue at stake. So these are the sources of power of the ancient civilizations: theology, technology, and then social treaty. Okay, social treaty between kingdoms, between people. Okay, so this is what was happening. We will now look at this issue of theology. We would kind of delve deeper into theology after this.
Discover a transformative journey into the kingdom of heaven. Following the initial publication, the author dives deeper with 2 insightful follow-up books. Ever felt disconnected from God even in worship? Explore how God's unconventional ways can transform your life. How can you align with divine plans, avoiding distractions? Find answers in The Kingdom of Heaven on Earth and The 3, Illuminating Christian Truths and Prophetic Practices. Unlock profound insights guiding you toward a deeper connection with God. Don't miss out. Dive into this enlightening exploration today. Click the link on the caption to get your copy.
That was actually exciting for me. I love to read history like this when it does not turn up any ethnic enmity and hatred. It's very interesting because it's good to read the past, okay, to look at the legacies of the past, okay. We all come from somewhere, and those things are important in understanding who we are today, and this is just my interest here, okay. These things determine a lot what is happening today, and when you look at it, you tend to feel kind of sad when you see that there's very poor understanding of what was really took place then, and poor understanding of what we have now, okay. And this is what is causing a lot of the problems, and especially when you look at the theological influence, okay. We talked about witchcraft, we talked about the protection of Africa through witchcraft for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, okay. And some of that witchcraft was actually deception. The Africans pretended to be witches, okay. They came at night. Of course, being of dark skin or black skin, they could camouflage themselves at night. And if they conducted a raid, of course, nobody would see them. And so the Europeans had to go back, mostly were stopped at the shores of Libya, places in Algeria. Most of the time, limited themselves to the shores for hundreds, even thousands of years. It was technology that enabled them to come deeper into Africa during the Christian period. Okay, the knights enabled them with the discovery of metal. They were able to now empower themselves to invade deeper into Africa. And it was the Christian kingdoms that found an inroad into Africa even before the Muslims came in, okay, and took over the Christian establishment, and now became a more dominant empire, okay. So this is just what it is. So looking at the theological idea, okay, even though Christianity had taken over, there was still those issues, cultural practices that had survived for thousands of years, were still very, very strong. And even in Europe, Christianity was not able to totally remove the influence of paganism. When you look at the one in England and the United Kingdom, you find that that was a real issue. In fact, the legend of Arthur shows very clearly that Arthur did not really go on the takeover on the platform of Christianity. He took over under nativity until later on Christian reformers came and they changed it, okay. But this was what was going on in Africa. Even though the Nubians were Christians, the Ethiopians were Christians, there was a lot of nativity. Up to today, you go to Ethiopia, that is the problem they are having. A lot of native tribes that refuse to whether take on Islam or Christianity, okay. They remain the way they are, and this is what happened, and that is why slavery continued, probably, okay. We cannot say for sure, but that is because when somebody is, the concept, like I have said in many of my videos, is that the native religions, they don't really emphasize prosperity. They don't really emphasize development, okay. Technology is evil to them, okay, and so they remain, they prefer to remain naked in their very, very mundane state, and so that prospered slavery, the weaker person, of course, the only way, and there was little to trade those days, so why not trade labor? Slavery is a very old thing. And so they decided to trade in labor, seize some of these people, and some of them were the weakest among the tribes, so they were rounded up and sold in exchange for horses, in exchange for metal, and so on and so forth. And this continued for thousands of years. And these people practiced magic. They practiced a lot of witchcraft. And believe it or not, no matter what science says, some of this witchcraft is real. Okay, it is real, and it actually has a lot of influence in society. Okay, and this was what, let's say, unfortunately, actually, some of the kingdoms relied on in warfare. Okay, they relied on this spiritual power, okay, to win their battles. And this went on under the Christian kingdoms, under the Muslim kingdoms. And this was a very contemporary evidence of this was in the Yentasini, or the Metasini group, that started right from the time of independence and reached its apogee around 1980, okay, where about 5,000 people died in the Kanu riots, okay? And this continued. The fear of Metasini became the beginning of wisdom. Throughout the 80s, like I told you last time, as a child, it was the beginning of wisdom to fear Metasini, okay? You know, you don't, when they say don't go to work today, Metasini is coming out, you don't go to work, okay? Because they were seen as bloodsuckers, literally. Yeah, that they would actually kill a person and consume the person's blood. Okay, so this is what was going on. So they were sorcerers. Okay, they had a lot of powerful magic. As the word Sini, okay, implies. Okay, they were the Yentasini or the Metasini. They were called the Metasini, but in actuality it was the Yentasini. Okay, and what is the Sini? What does Sini mean? Sini means it's a curse. Okay, or a malice. It is used to describe a situation, a person, or object that is believed to be causing harm or misfortune through supernatural means, according to translate.com here. The term can also refer to a spell, incantation used to inflict harm. So these Yentasini were believed to be powerful magicians. Okay, of course, you can trace that root on into Christianity. The assassins, the assassin, okay, fans of John Wick, of course, they used to use assassins to keep the church, you know, as some of the knights of the church, to protect the church. Okay, so this was probably borrowed directly from there. Okay, so they became the Yentasini, okay, the people of faith, had magical powers. You know, so this is the thing that you have to understand. The influence of theology is very, very strong in the kingdoms of Africa. How they maintained dominance, how they ruled Africa. Okay, and this is a very contemporary, just as early as 1980, phenomenon that gives us this evidence that we need. Okay, so we need to understand this. Okay, wow, that was something. Now let us look at the resurgence of this concept during the more recent Just crisis. Okay, starting from about 2001 right to 2010. Okay, how did this influence the Just crisis? Now the Christians of Jos were very, very pietistic people. Okay, they were taught to give food on Christmas Day. On Christmas Day, they would package the food and they would take it to the Muslims. The Muslims, sometimes on Salah, would do the same thing. Package their food and bring to the Christians. And it was some believed they shouldn't collect this food between both sides. And some did. They didn't collect this food because they didn't believe, they believed that consuming this food would be practicing of course, that religion which they didn't believe in. But this was a kind of a period of peace within the Muslim Christians for decades within the Jos area. Okay? The Yentasini were seen as actually evil. Okay? People who were very extremists in Islam. And of course, even the Muslims within Jos did not really vibe with that group. Okay? And that is why it died a natural death within the 80s. The concept was there, but it died, okay, within the 80s. Until, like I said, the Bauchi crisis took place, and subsequently the Kaduna crisis. Two or three Kaduna crises that took place within the early 90s, okay? So, what happened? The combination of the Kaduna, the Bauchi crisis, and the crisis that took place in Jos 1995, and again in 2001, the very destructive crisis of 2001, some Christians began to rethink their stance on the practice of Christianity as it was, okay? And they felt that they were being killed haphazardly. And because of that, they decided, why not go back to the ancient practices? Magic, okay? They felt this was the only way to conquer the things they were seeing, because they were seeing the Yentasine within the Muslim militants that were sometimes rioting on the street. Okay, so they saw the Yentasine there, killing people, with their curved swords, sickles as they were, that could harvest somebody's head from a distance. And, it was terrible. And so some of these Christians began to return to the ancient magic, okay? They began to return to the ancient magic so that they could defend themselves also. And this was the resurgence of mystical solutions in the Jos crisis. Okay? In fact, some of the stories are so gory, I cannot tell them. The Jos crisis that happened in 2001 was just the beginning of something. Actually, not the beginning. It was sort of mid-beginning. It had started in 1995, like I said. Okay? And there were some issues that started taking place within the state itself, the Plateau state itself. And there were attacks taking place in southern Plateau especially, and that was where a lot of the magic was being seen. And a lot of the people down south in Plateau began to return to that practice of magical arts to defend themselves. And that was the beginning, like I said, that lit up the whole problem, okay? And leading up to the insurgency of 2010, okay? Of course, starting from Kaduna, remember that, into Bauchi, and then when it engulfed Jos, and in 1 year engulfed Kanu also, okay? And that was the end of it. The insurgency began in 2010. So this is the problem, okay? So this is the problem. And it's still happening, because once in a while somebody just raids, trying to stop freedom of speech. Some of these raids that take place, like the one that took place last month, I believe some of them are happening to stop freedom of speech, to stop Christians from going to churches, to stop talking and preaching their message. Like Eliza Griswold recorded part of it when she visited the Borno area just before the crisis took place. And she recorded how a missionary's experience of his work on the mission field. Some of these crises are a response to evangelism, okay? And so this is just the truth of it. And so when you talk about suppressing freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, some of these crises can be directly linked to that. That is why you can link it directly to the jihad. There is no way to suppress freedom of speech if you're not suppressing, describe it if it's not suppressing freedom of speech. And this is what we see, the resurgence of necromancy. And I tried to point out in my previous videos that some of the agreements within this development, some of the agreements that we see between those who practice this ancient magic called necromancy, that we've described as necromancy, and some of the Tassini people within the Islamic context are one and the same, okay? Yes, that we see an agreement between them, and their aim is to now suppress Christian worship and within these years, we've seen semblances of this. So, while some of these Christians have gone back to defend themselves, suddenly found themselves, fighting Christianity itself, because they have to make agreements with spiritual beings, of course, and those spiritual beings are against Christianity, okay, the practice of Christianity. So this is what we see going on. So the theological foundation of government in Africa is very important, and we see it. And that is why when you remove one system, you have to replace it with another. And that is why Christianity and Islam were the replacement for that ancient system. And so when they began to clash, of course, that system came back up, okay, as a sort of a solution for some people. Okay, that was the only way they could defend themselves. So this is the thing. When some of them could not find solutions in Christianity, because Christians were told to turn the other cheek, as Jesus would. Okay, and so, but they were seeing their people dying, and so they went back to that system. Okay, so some of people in Europe can even resonate with that, can understand what was going on then. Okay, so this is what happened. Okay, after I have said this, I must say that what is the solution? We must ask this question: what is the solution? There must be a solution to it. Sometimes when I watch media, I get kind of concerned. Okay. Because a lot of our media people, commentators out there, don't know the social issues and the problems. The return to ancient practices was actually instigated by some of these, sometimes Western people, okay, who felt that the practices of the ancient Africans were innocent practices. Of course, but when we look at it through the eyes of the Tassini and through some of the things that are going on now, we know that these are not really innocent practices per se. Okay, yes, a form of self-defense, but not really innocent practices. The devastating effect it has on society cannot be, actually compared with anything we had during the time Christianity was dominant, from our own experience, okay, in this very area, the Jos Plateau, okay, when Christianity was dominant in the Jos Plateau, I mean, there was some kind of love relatively to this time, Yes, so let's try to round up this. We've looked at that, okay, so that we can understand the context of what is really happening in many parts of the world, and also in Africa here. Okay, a lot of it is not the fault of the people. A lot of it is just because of the development, of course. Imagine an ancient tradition. It's been like removed, and it was not completed. That removal was not completed. It still existed. Then another one comes on top. Korarafa, Hausa, then Islam, then what? The English. Okay, and layers and layers of different systems all governing at once, and so it is creating some of the problems. Of course, in the greater Nigeria, of course, in the southeast, they had a different program going on. In the southwest, I've not talked about that. They had their own issues going on, and that is why the southwesterners tend to be more amenable to current developments than other parts of Nigeria. Okay, because they were not fully conquered by Islam. Okay, so they had their own system that was trading, the Benin that was trading with the Guararafa at some point. Okay, that was still existing. So they had less interference. So what you had was just the Benin, and then the being, of course, trading with the Hausas. Then the English came in. Okay, they were not fully conquered yet. Okay. And many parts also in the Middle Belt, but of course, conquering is relative. So, and the Southeast also, they tend to accept the system at play more than other parts of the country. because those other parts of the country, if you are being told that the north is the problem, the north is the problem, that is the reason. Okay, because there are many layers of powerful kingdoms, ruling at the same time. Okay, so it is not really their fault. And what should have solved the problem was the Christian system that was brought. It should have solved the problem, and it was actually doing so. But the conflict between Christianity and Islam now created the truncation of that process. And the process is still going on. We're seeing it still. But like what happened with the Muslims and the choreographer, it has been truncated again. Okay? And of course, it cannot move forward. So Christianity is supposed to solve that problem. And we see the world has matured to a particular level. Okay? The world is like a time, a clock. Okay? Everything works in some kind of rhythm. And this is what some of the movers of necromancy are trying to say. That necromancy works with rhythm, okay? And so we should go back to that. But the rhythm dictated a system in play, okay? You cannot merge those two systems, okay? Necromancy itself is rhythmatic to the desires of a spirit being, maybe a demon, for a local place. And this demon for one local place is different from the demon of the other local place. So it's a totally different thing. But in Christianity, it's all subservient to one person, Jesus Christ. Okay? So you cannot mix that with Christianity. It doesn't work. And the mundane, a very simplistic mind of those who practice necromancy think that it's one and the same thing. No, it's not. Okay? It's not. And this is what you need to know. And so the world has come full cycle to the point where certain things are supposed to take place. But because of this confusion, of course, you know that certain things will happen. And this is what explains some of the global crisis, okay, that is taking place. Okay, it explains that. So this is the issue. And many people are searching for meaning within this, and they tend to be lost within this system because of this confusion. Okay, so there are certain alliances that seem to be uncertain within this time, okay, in this modern world, because it is thoroughly mixed with the ancient world, and the ancient world is trying to come back up. I explained that in my first video on necromancy. It's not too clear, but you can hear the sound, so listen to that video. Okay, the resurgence again of necromancy, because it is mixed, it never died down. It wants to take over again. Necromancy always comes to take over. Okay, biblical theology, Christian theology explains it very well. But the problem with Christian theology is that it is not a universal theology. Okay, we have just about 30% of the world population, and of course, even within that 30%, we don't know exactly who are really committed to Christianity. Okay, so this is the problem. So there is that uncertainty because of the mixing of these different traditions, and we see that in the current liberalism in the US. Okay, it is a liberalism that has come from Europe, and you need to understand the concept here. What is really going on here? Okay, liberalism that is plaguing the US is actually from Europe. Okay, but how it matured in Europe was through the development of Christianity. Okay, and they went through the same thing we are going through now here in Africa. And to avoid some of the problems we had here in Africa, for Europeans, the solution was war. They fought each other and killed one another till the strongest survived. That was for Europe. And the aim was to establish modern civilization. Okay? The aim was to establish modern civilization for them. The problem with Africa is that the aim for Africa is to go back and establish the ancient civilization. Now that is the problem. But for Europeans, it was modern civilization. Okay? Midwifed by Christianity. Okay? So they decided to, for the most part, de-emphasize Christianity, emphasize modern civilization, and that is what has created the Europe that we see. Okay? A liberal Europe. And it's that liberalism that is affecting the United States right now. Okay, and the United States is struggling with which one to pick. Is it the liberal culture or the Christian culture? And they're really struggling with that. Okay, because the United States itself is a mix of many people from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, and so this is what is creating the problem. So there is an uncertain alliance between liberalism and Christianity. And because of that, we see the uncertain future of global civilization, as it were. There is a growing realigning of forces, okay, between the Eastern forces under BRICS, and of course Western forces are busy trying to rewrite their own relationship, okay, redetermine what are the parameters that govern their relationship. But they are still a very strong alliance, okay. So this is what is happening, okay. Within Christianity itself, there is a threat. Will Christianity survive or will it die? Okay, globally, it's a threat. Will it survive or will it die? And that is what is going on. Islam itself has one destination in mind, and that destination is world dominance through jihad, and that is what is causing some of the problems globally. Okay, should Islam be stopped or should it be managed? Currently, it is being managed. Okay, they are liberal Muslims, of course, and they are trying to help, but of course this issue of fundamentalism still comes up. Okay, so this is the issue. And of course mysticism, still a very powerful, a lot of modern people, the world is about 8 billion strong, and there are so many people that want to try mysticism as a solution to life, okay, problems. And some of these people don't understand what we know here in Africa, okay, and they go into this thing and they create problems even for us here, okay. And we're telling them, no, go back to your Christianity. Even if Christianity is just yours, as some of them think it is, you just go back to it. And no one is so interested. They don't know what we're going through. Okay, so that is just that. On the lighter note, okay. So this is the thing. And what is the final thing? Science and technology. Science and technology is pitted as a solution for us in this time. Europe, it is midwifed by Europe, of course, as a civilization that was able to borrow from many civilizations and create its own original modern civilization. And it is a solution. And of course, I am one of those that believes very strongly in this solution. Okay? As long as it is midwifed by a very strong moral system. And that is the danger that we have. There are a lot of hands that are irresponsible, and they might create another problem. I was hearing the number of nuclear weapons that India and Pakistan own between the two of these countries, and I was like shocked. Terrible. And this is what is going on. Okay, so technology is a very dangerous force, but is also a force for is a very, very potent solution to the problems we have in 21st century. And if only we can tap into this moral power and this social power and avoid the problems that we can see here. Somehow, Nigeria is an example of things we should avoid, unfortunately. Okay, we thank God for God's mercy that He has protected us by giving us a little of the resources we need to survive this period. But it all depends on the people, if they will accept the solutions that God has given them, within Nigeria. But Nigeria is an example of all that should not happen. And if the global powers learn from our example, they will know what to avoid and what to encourage. I am David Ndichinke for you today in Searching the Heart.
Discover a transformative journey into the kingdom of heaven. Following the initial publication, the author dives deeper with 2 insightful follow-up books. Ever felt disconnected from God even in worship? Explore how God's unconventional ways can transform your life. How How can you align with divine plans, avoiding distractions? Find answers in The Kingdom of Heaven on Earth, and the 3, Illuminating Christian Truths and Prophetic Practices. Unlock profound insights guiding you toward a deeper connection with God. Don't miss out. Dive into this enlightening exploration today. Click the link on the caption to get your copy.